Thanks so much, Zakir, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. And I'm so happy to be able to be in conversation with Antoine and Max. And it was really special to have this kind of come together with Antoine's visit to New York. Hopefully, we had wished to all be here in person, but alas, that's not the case. So I was going to open just with the first text, the introduction, and just read that to kind of set things up. And then I was going to ask Antoine to give us a little bit of biographical historical context, and then we'll go into a discussion throughout. If people have questions, we want this to be kind of like an open discussion. So if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, however you want. Q&A gives you the anonymous ability, and then we'll like try to weave those into our conversation too. So the first text, which was also, this book was first put together by Hocquenghem for his dissertation, for his thesis. And the title of the thesis is also the title of the text I'm going to read, which is Volutions. That's the word in French is also Volution. But I left it because there's not really another word for it. So I'll read the text. It starts with an epigraph from Jean-François Lyotard. An attitude that will no longer even be revolutionary in the sense of reversal, return, but volutionary in the sense of will, in the sense of willing whatever is possible. We will no longer do the laurels are cut, recap, resent, rehash, repeat. They were right to baptize May a dress rehearsal. There is no revolution. We no longer want to share the prefixes that moor the flight of our wills, their overflow dissolving our powers. Above all, when these prefixes reinfect us with their sickness of the past, the tradition of the worker movement, their stupid idea of change. We rehash other ideas and restart civilization, the same civilization we want to forget. Changing words while keeping the prefixes, and thus revolution becomes reactionary. That is to say that here we are not recapitulating or making a revolution. The desired disruption can't be reduced to repainting in red, to returning everything to its place, to paying off the debts of the proletariat. In short, to making a revolution, a world turned upside down, showing the real truth of its hypocritical intentions, merely turning the wheel around the untouched center, man, his wife, and his children, without law or self. The revolutionary side only exists in relation to the bourgeois world against which it wants to rise up. Its existence only lays claim to the assumed debts of the exploiters, an especially fake claim since capital tends towards a cynicism where it drags along a growing part of the population that is mesmerized by the media. Why invoke justice, demand so-called rights for the oppressed, when the system answers, the real guilty ones are the victims and not the assassins? When in the USA, members of the military who are guilty of genocide, like Lieutenant Calley, get called misunderstood heroes. When we see leftist campaigns face not the incomprehension, but the actual hostility of the people, we can no longer count on bourgeois guilt. The revolutionary side plays the game of morality while capital cheats and wins. To be revolutionary or not, to take it or leave it, to be in or out, leftist superiority, the irrevocable judgment of revolutionary normality. Sacred words, revolution more than any other. It's not even about choosing between bourgeois vice or its opposite, the virtue of revolutionaries. This is what the latter hide from us with their mythology of the revolutionary subject, the proletariat, and their sacrosanct strategy. The immense number of paths unexplored, untraveled, or abandoned too early. If we add up the tracks in question with the encompassing term cultural revolution, we might win the respect of Leninists and the bourgeois, whatever the case may be. But we then lose the invaluable splintering of all the false alliances. We lose it because this packaging kicks off the game of representation, where they speak in the name of and in the place of the so-called totality about the results of an exploration they haven't even made. Above all, we lose hopelessly if we are blackmailed by revolutionary bias and accept the lowest common denominator, revolutionary politics as the phallic culmination of all local organizing. This universal currency makes all strategies interchangeable. This steady compromise between ideological imperialisms consolidates the revolutionary side like gold consolidates the bourgeois side. where we can count, measure, compare the forces of each. We have no need to measure our upheavals by this abstract universal standard, the revolution, which invariably lets the bourgeois see the level of danger, measures it, localizes it, and confines it. Instead, we should be going in all directions, shaking off the civilizing power that tails us, digging up the structure wherever one can undermine it, always surprising the enemy from behind, never being exactly where they expect. And so it becomes obvious there is no revolutionary subject, no subject at all. There are historical drives that make this piece of our social skin bristle, that make that organ of our social body quiver. By breaking away from our identities, we are without limits to our passions. Of course, at first, we invoked our multiple selves against the despotic grand subject of history, treating them as irreducible. But when brought fully into light, this self, which they've used to scare and shame us, actually describes our real strengths, which spring up wild and unsuspected. The trap of subjectification, which puts all of reality under the domination of the subject, vanishes. By looking at ourselves instead of hiding and whimpering, grumbling, fighting against the misery of the world, we've seen our image decompose, our self shrivel, crack, shatter into pieces thrown to the four corners of the universe right before our eyes. Civilization, the nervous breakdown. But at the heart of its troubles, the dying civilization finds an effective venom to inject in us, the arsenic of the crisis. For minds immune to the fascisms, the wars, consumerism, and other even stronger emotions, only the scene of the millennium can still control the bleeding of the old world's credibility. The form of the apocalypse is a convenient representation to give to the wish to be done with the old codes, to contain, drown, and diffuse possible outbreaks. A horror show. Strange shocks quake a fissured ground. Noxious gases escape, heralding the mysterious birth pangs that gasp from below, creating inconceivable monsters for us. In the minds of the elderly, wars without a red cross. For much of the youth, the end of capitalist growth and the return to an ecological prehistory. The crisis steps up its theatrics. Only pompous speech can pull together a decomposing social body in the midst of terror and breathe the semblance of a soul into the rule of capital. No more controlling history. After the misfire of revolution, after the failure of the hope born after May of fashioning a social reality by will alone, comes the great black hole from which we will never return, the doomsday device of a crisis that no one can do anything about, even the militants advocating human responsibility. Farewell, progress of man, enlightened and scientific. Farewell also to his mirror image, the revolution, as pinnacle of social progress, the highest realization of humanity. Greetings to the monsters of the historical unconscious, a procession of unused pyres and slums, pyres and mysticisms, comets and regressions. The wheel of history turns like mad with the danger of dislocating or decentering the Earth's axis. It will turn backward from now on toward a new Middle Age, the end of dialectical temporality. Who would dare brag again that crisis breeds revolution? There's no point in acting, fighting, writing. The tragic voice screams, what will remain when the hell of crisis is unleashed? Impossible to wish when all that remains is for the rats to find a calm corner in the ship tossed about by the hurricane. The repetition of terror, not of orgasm, takes hold. This is what the most shocking geopolitical management is trying to establish today, a social energy crisis that could empty hearts and bodies. An extraction of the new energies unveiled by the outbreak of deconstructive desires. A good dose of collapse, of pileup, of weakening of productive forces, but also of forces of desire. A grand battle in our brains on a planetary scale, and the stakes are no longer only the pumping of black gold, but also the hijacking, and why not, the drying up of desire. The great multinational soft machine tries to achieve dehumanization in the face of the desiring flood, to outstrip it by eroding vital power through a brutal devaluation of hopes. A terrible branding is restored. The law of the great transcendent power, which must be terrible and imposing, since in the end, the supposedly orgasmic fires of consumerism have only heated up evolutionary desires, instead of satisfying and sedating them. Since you don't want to be sated, you will be bludgeoned by that shadowy repression emerging from nowhere, the crisis. The thrill of the great unknown we were promised only turns out to be the forerunner of a long bed rest. The little desires are put to bed. Here comes the great corpse. We already knew that we didn't know what awaited us, and that is what inspired us. Give to this unknown the mask of the crisis and game over, the enemy exercised. Tragic superiority and historical fatalism, those old and repulsive fogies, replace the coming attraction. The crisis is Mr. Thiel suppressing the commune of our desires, the Versailles of difficult necessity, gunning down the hopes of after May. Man is once again wolf to man. Moreover, he had never ceased being a wolf according to the phony appearances of indefinite progress. You know it well. You've shouted about it enough, so what are you complaining about? Besides, the crisis is the ultimate cure for boredom. Vincent Pontet's topic, the refreshing and merry crisis for those rallied by a new Bastide, new scam, and contrick to trap the desire for change, the final manipulation of desire for jouissance turned into desire for repression and apocalypse, civilization and its discontents instead of liberation of flux. The last seduction, the multinational octopus brings you its new show, melodrama where farce failed. The face of the death drive tops off the dance of civilization. Through the looking glass of the end of history, our eyes do not see Alice's field of speaking flowers, but instead, the bitter return toward the difficult periods of humanity. There are also the perverts of the crisis, those who anticipate the orgy of the great catastrophe. The old morality buried, here come the cynics, sequined and made up, ready to drink champagne in the ruins. Decadents like Bowie, bittersweet salon queens, snobs of the latest fashion, who come to lick the feet of the great collapse. Confusing decryption and decadence, apostles of the fin du siècle trend of an end-of-world ideology, they turn the call for the transversal into a scandal in the halls of the Académie Française. They get the nervous pleasure of believing in their elegance during the crisis of civilization, glorifying the corrupt. In short, just another way of reattaching to the civilized world and its fantasies, even if it means playing the unworthy children, wasteful heirs participating in the furious potlatch of the collapse of values, debilitating an egotistical claim of being the last debauchés and not the first mutants. Enough of the hopeless ones easily softened by their own fates, ex-militants doomed to getting high joyously, who've already seen everything but not lived at all. In their own eyes, born too late in a world too old, already an old tune. Ridiculous like children born late to that elderly couple, fascism and fashion. In the new 1929, we have new Cocteau. It's once again surprise me, Jean, without surprise, but drunk with remorse. Pleasure is reclaimed from failure by those who find themselves agreeably kept by the future fascisms, failed copies of Maurice Sacks, or of those women shaved by the liberation, swimming in caviar that tastes like ashes. Image is only good for selling the idea of no longer believing in anything, as if it were a question of belief. Not beyond, but on this side of good and evil, the allure of an unhappy consciousness nurturing its unhappiness with the pleasure of dancing on the volcano. Such is the libidinal charm of the fascism cropping up today. But why bother enjoying the leftovers and burning their ships in the final party of ressentiment? We are talking about going elsewhere, leaving the ideological rot still studded with glitter, splitting, no longer giving in to the civilized neuroses tasting of angst. The fumes of the contemporary nervous breakdown only affect weak heads. That doesn't mean taking pleasure in the chance of being born during an epoch doomed to decay. On the contrary, let's speak. Let's take action. Let's cut into this flaccid reality of 20th century daily life. Let's get rid of the embittered implications heavy with meaning that give our action the perfume of disillusioned, aged youth. Putting on makeup, dancing, making love should not imply merging into the sickening slime of the suffering of the final days. Following May. Leaving behind the choice between a revolutionary moralism and the affectation of the new libertines, such is, for the author, the question posed by this book right now. The articles that make it up are so many attempts to tear away the ruptures of a daily life outside the law from the dictatorship of revolutionary superiority. Prism of one path among others, multiple trails littered with sparks of an enduring May. We don't want to come back to these trails like a dog retracing its steps to smell the places where it has pissed. Moreover, we don't want to unfurl pretentiously the dialectical red carpet of consecutive states of consciousness that lead towards some more general truth over the grand staircase of progress. The following sketches work by erasures, bumps, resets, thus no single direction, and above all, not the rancid result of sneering disenchantment where desire dissolves. Yes, with this multiplicity, presented here only in part, we want to kill the God revolution, Bring an end to the use of a single will whose giant-like strength would come from giving up all kinds of little desires. The will of a battering ram to break down the largely mythical center of capital, more supple than its enemy. The revolution is always stuck in the previous war. Instead, these thousands of little desires, partial drives, tiny obsessions, will remake the world for us with jouissance at its head. No, we don't believe that the new scarcity makes our volutions obsolete, except to infantilize them with the paltry leftovers of a superfluous decadence. There's nothing to be learned from the talk about consumerism, nothing special in the discussion of the crisis, if not to learn new possibilities of transversal invention. And it's not by cutting back after having faked an opening that they'll keep us prisoners. If we experience jouissance and luxury without bitterness, who cares about the price of gas? To stir up the forces of the imagination, there's no need to believe in a society of abundance. Here we see the after May as a multiple life change. The after May of faunes is made of leaps in all the fields of the possible, not in faithfulness to a fixation. It is an after without a backward glance at a May otherwise well-behaved, a horny myth notwithstanding, without kids' nightmares about the crisis. It's like a summer afternoon. So I'll stop there. And yeah, Antoine, do you want to talk a little bit about Hocquenghem and the time in which this was written?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. I must say first that I'm very happy to participate to this discussion, and many thanks to Zakir, to Santiago, and Michael for organizing everything. And I'm very pleased to have the conversation with Scott and Max. But before perhaps to say a few words about the context, I must also say that I'm very pleased that L'Après-Mai has been translated into English. As Zakir said, very few sales by Hocquenghem were and still are available in English. And it's for me, a very important issue related to the circulation of an author and his writing and his works from one cultural space to another, and intimately connected to relationship of power and domination through languages, through cultural circulation. And when few texts are available, there is, of course, a stronger risk of misunderstanding or misappropriation or misreading. At least there is a very incomplete portrait of an author and his works. So I'm always glad to discuss on issues of translation and circulation, and very, very glad to be able to read L'Après-Mai in English. I don't know how familiar you are with Hocquenghem's life, so I will say a few words about him. So he was born in 1946. He grew up, and he comes from a bourgeois family. His parents were both professors, and he grew up in Paris or in the Parisian suburbs. He was educated at the prestigious Lycée Henri IV in Paris, where he met the philosopher René Scherrer, who became his lover and then his co-author of several books. And then he studied also at the very prestigious École Normale Supérieure of the Rue d'Ulm, where he was admitted in 1976. From the middle of the 60s, he was a Marxist activist and a gauchiste one, according to the French term. Gauchiste for the French left meant at the left of the Communist Party, and especially in opposition to the Communist Party during the 60s, which this opposition expressed itself in particular of the subject of Algerian war, the struggle against imperialism, and also the Stalinism in Soviet Union. He was first member of the youth and student organization of the Communist Party, and then he was with other activists excluded from this youth organization, and he became an active member of the Jeunesse communiste révolutionnaire, which was a Trotskyist group and ancestor of the current Nouveau Parti anti-capitalist, the new anti-capitalist party, which still exists in France. Hocquenghem was very involved during the events of spring '68. And then he was excluded from the Trotskyist group, and he became Mao's Pontex, which is a combination of Maoism and spontaneism, a kind of libertarian Maoism. And then in 1971, he joined the FHAR, the Front Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire, the first modern gay group in France, which was founded in Paris. Hocquenghem was not one of the founders of the FHAR, but he was like not the spokesperson, as the FHAR was not organized, but one of the prominent activists, one leader perhaps, and one of the main activists perhaps. And he was especially responsible for the coordination of several issues of newspaper or magazine, like the newspaper Tout, which was a Mao's Pontex Maoist spontaneist magazine. And then Hocquenghem was also the coordinator of the issue of Recherche, which was named the big encyclopedia of homosexualities, which was released in 1973. And so l'après-mai des faunes was part, as Scott said, as his PhD thesis. He joined in 1969 the University of Vincennes, which was an experimental university founded just after May '68, with the idea of challenging the traditional and academic Sorbonne. And Vincennes, and especially the Department of Philosophy of the university, became like a very huge center for politics and for philosophy. Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, among others, were teaching at Vincennes. And Hocquenghem defended his thesis in philosophy in 1974 with the first part, which was Homosexual Desire, his first book, published in 1972, and then a collection of texts, manifestos, and essays, which will become L'après-mai des faunes, and then published a few months later. He wrote more than, I think, 20 books from until 1988, when he died by AIDS. And so L'après-mai des faunes was his second book. To me, it's a very, very fundamental and important book, perhaps one of his most important books, which can be read at different levels or from different point of view, as an history, of Hocquenghem himself and of his trajectory, but also as an history of May '68 in France, and of the beginning of the '70s and all the political leftist struggles of the beginning of the '70s. As we said, it's a collection of text, of article, of political manifesto, and through them we can see the shift of Hocquenghem from traditional Marxist or leftist activism at the left of the Communist Party to the gay activism with the foundation of the FHAR, and then to a new political attitude, which is very, very hard to name precisely, but he summed up with the word evolution, as Scott read. And it's very striking to see how each text is separated to the previous one or to the following one from few months only, or perhaps from 1 year, and we can see a succession of steps which reveal all the shifts and this invention of a new political attitude. And we have to keep in mind that it was completely impossible to be gay in the left in May 68 in France, and still after May 68. And all these texts show how the idea of the self, of changing life, of transforming everyday life, of homosexuality, of desire, appeared and became recognized as political. I'm, for instance, thinking to texts on drugs, on music, on life in communities, and so on. We can also see, and this is why it's also very interesting for an history of a radical left, how each text can be read also as a response to other position inside the left. For instance, there is one text devoted to the question of établissement, like establishment. I'm not sure if it's the right translation in English, but the fact for activists to become workers in factory in order to spread the revolution, or to spread Marxist ideas or practices. And there is a very interesting discussion in Hocquenghem writings about this idea of devoting oneself or sacrificing for the revolution. And the second very interesting point is that the book can be read not only through this journey of Hocquenghem, but as an analysis 6 years after of what May 68 has been, and which lessons have to be learned from the movement of May 68 and all the social movements after May 68. Hocquenghem, as it's very clear in the first text, Révolution, Hocquenghem claims something new happened, something in him, a new attitude. He speaks of volition, that is to say revolution without the first three, of transversalism, and there is a very clear breakup with Marxism, and especially with the hegemonic position of Marxism, with the idea of hierarchy of struggles where economics is at the top. And on the contrary, Hocquenghem tries to think how to deal with the multiplicity of struggle, how always to interpolate, it is the word he used, interpolate, one struggle with another. And there are also some thoughts about something he didn't name intersectionality, but which is very close to a lot of debates that we can have today. That is to say, how to deal with several struggles which do not overlap, but are, on the contrary, conflicting. And there is also something very libertarian or anarchist, but it's why it's strongly also interesting to see how, Scott, you are connecting it today to anarchism. Perhaps I will stop there to open the discussion and not to speak too much.
Thank you so much, Antoine, for all that background information, and also tying a lot of it together, and kind of gave a really nice overview of the work in the book too. The one thing that I wanted to add that I thought was really exciting about the book when I first read it is that we have a sort of chronological order of the text, like you said, that kind of show his development, or like his reactions to things that were happening in the movement. But then in his like re-editing of it, he has interspersed between the text and italics reflections on the text, like from the point of view where he is now. So he's critiquing himself often and showing where he thinks like he fell flat, or like, you know, kind of sometimes poking fun at himself. So that's really interesting, I think, to see, because it shows that this development was something that he's like continuing to do. And even in later books like La Dérive Homosexuel, he does the same thing where it's like kind of looking at the text. So that I didn't read from any of that, but there's a lot of like information there, and it's like they're so condensed. There's like a lot of interesting thoughts, I think, to unpack from how he looks back at himself. But also, Max, if you wanted to jump in, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add just for the beginning. You're muted.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to make a very similar point, actually. I think, yeah, and also, yeah, thank you, Antoine, for that really useful gloss, and Scott also for doing this translation. But yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting book because it's like, I mean, I love this this like opening tone that he has, and then as you progress through the text, you get actually like the like pamphlets and writing from like these journals and stuff that they were doing earlier that he's critiquing in this opening thing. So if you like look at the dates, you can kind of like begin to put together a progression that this first text is a bit of a critique of. And yeah, so I mean, for that reason, I think it's a really valuable document because it shows why you would end up at the position he does in 1974. And it shows like the kind of like excessive or bombastic or whatever kind of like flourishes that they're using in the midst of this like the uprising of 68 and then the immediate sort of years after, where you're trying to figure out how to like relate to this totally like overwhelming event that like both seems to be receding really quickly out of your grasp and also like kind of like being frozen into place by people who have this kind of like strange fidelity or memory or want to like maneuver themselves in relation to it to like he talks about in this passage, kind of like redo what they were already working on or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just had a question. I don't want to like, if we're going to be moving towards more reading soon, I don't want to derail, but I think this question of like how he is relating to this immediate past, and then how he's kind of like asking us to relate to it is really interesting to me. I mean, there's what is the line? Yeah, the line in the last paragraph that you stopped at is like, the aftermath of faunes is made of leaps in all the fields of the possible, not in faithfulness to a fixation. It is an after without a backward glance at a may, otherwise well behaved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that's really interesting because I guess like I find myself often doing that. You know, and I think in some ways he is engaged in that, right? He's sifting through his papers from this moment that he's still kind of faithful to, even though he's critiquing it. But he's critiquing it with the aim of being faithful to like what was really at stake in May 68, rather than like what was sort of like only manifestly. And I think it has, I mean, yeah, it's a really interesting question that kind of like poses a kind of funny demand on the reader now, right? It's like, okay, why would it be interesting to revisit this stuff? Is it because we want to kind of like memorialize it or reenact it, or, you know, I mean, in some ways you could imagine it would be more faithful to this sort of injunction to totally forget it, right? Like, in fact, like his real position would be, you know, to what does he say? Well, you didn't read this last line, but yeah, to consult these texts like pages ripped out of a diary, like as in, so like not sequentially, not something that like commands a strict kind of like temporal order. So yeah, I guess I'm just curious what both of you think about that question.
Well, I think about that also when we were first organizing this. Antoine asked me, why did I choose to translate this book? And it's for some of these reasons. Like I said, there was like the nerdy part of me that said it's the second book, and his first book has been translated, so it was translated his second book. But when I read it, well, first of all, I was just like, this is so pertinent to everything that is going on now in radical militant organizing, and people are just continuously doing the same thing that he's talking about, like all the time. It just happens over and over, and that's also what he's talking about in the piece that I just read, that you get stuck in this repetition. So I thought it was like, it has this like historical value and archival value of like showing the work that he was doing as a sort of revolutionary journalist and a militant in the streets. And like we can read it in that progression. What you said, I didn't read the like last paragraph of the piece, but he talks about like, you could read this like searching for cause and effect and doing this kind of temporal progression, or you could read it like in this kind of multivocal way, because he's also talking about writing while living amongst other militants and in like communal living situations. And so he says that it's not like a kind of uniform thing, and actually it like opens up to your desire. And so I think that like what's really interesting, I think there is like a historical desire for people, especially people who are like tend towards like leftist or whatever revolutionary politics, to think about May as some really exciting and important moment, which brings us to it. But there's like multiple Mays as he's talking about here, and what he's really struggling with in this moment is the recuperation of May into status politics, whether they're left or right, or like authoritarian politics. And so like the thing that you get in reading this, and in the weird way that it's put together through his kind of reflections on it, is that there's like the experience of May was the thing, right? Like the being in the streets, and people who like participate in street movements know about this. And like, I mean, this is fresh for anyone, during the George Floyd uprising too, I think. And I think that was a big moment for like, radicalizing people like May was in the 60s. And this maybe is sort of a diary of a radicalization too, that there's something that happens that like that once you talk about it, right? He says the game of representation, once you talk about it, like in a certain way, it gets lost. And I think that there's a way that he's trying to work out a politics that doesn't try to plug it into what we think we know. And that goes so far. It's not even just like, like this or that, like need that we need to meet and like how we need to counter the state. It's like even within ourselves, it's as big as civilization or the idea of humanity. Like all of those things are traps for him. And so like he's trying to find ways to kind of escape that recuperation through, I think, the kind of immediacy of the experience. And that I think is also why he presents all these texts that way, so it can like speak to your desire as a reader. Like, where do you plug into it, right? Where can you find what you're working? Like, there's so much in here for anyone organizing to be like, oh my God, I'm struggling with this thing right now. What does he have to say about it? And then the other thing, just on what you said, Max, that I think is really important to mention is that he like will have nothing to do with ideas of purity, right? And that the main kind of thing of this text, but it comes up in earlier texts too, in this book, is the revolutionary moralism that he wants to react to. Like there's this sort of, it's like asceticism, the enshrinement of like the worker, the idea that like you have to act a certain way, you can't do certain things if you want to be a revolutionary, which is part and parcel with, as what Antoine said, like the exclusion of gay people from those movements. And in a way, this, to me, a lot of what he writes like echoes other writings like the Combahee River Collective statement, Black lesbian feminists saying like they didn't fit in all these movements because their struggle was seen to be like after the like main revolutionary struggle. So he's saying that same kind of thing there. Well, I'll let Antoine speak if you want to say something.
Yeah, no, I wanted to add something about the fact that the one of the first texts of the book is dedicated to suicides and to the idea of the past and of the subjectivity that are produced by political involvements. And he also tries to deal with the fact that in May 68 and the year after, people really thought that it will be able to do something and to succeed in doing something. And it was not possible, or when people have been expected so much radical change that they couldn't accept, it did not happen. And there is something very, very striking in the way how it tries to escape the depression, and how to think to the I don't know how to define it, but to the political feelings or the political self, or the how to be a revolutionary, not depressed by the politics, even when the politics is the worst ever. And so he's also dealing with the past and the weight of the past. We often see in the radical politics that the past is something very positive, something we can find like inspiration, like ideas or models. And he's also trying to break with the past when he says that May 68 is over and we have to invent something new. And I think it's something not so common in the radical left, trying to, I don't know, I'm thinking to the text by Karl Marx on the coup d'état of Louis-Napoléon Bonaparte, when Marx also deals with the weight of the past and all the monster from the past, and which is always a very accurate question: how not to be limited by our political habitudes or political routines, and how to be able to invent something new and not be tied by what has been done before.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you brought up that, like, one of the things he's doing is trying to counter the depression that I think seeps in for a lot of people, revolutionaries, especially when you have this big moment like May, where it seemed like they were going to, I mean, they stopped the state for a number of days at least. And you feel like it's a failure, and then you get to the point of hopelessness, which I think is another thing that, as you said, is perpetual in a way. And then he refuses to succumb to that. I mean, there's there's a nastiness and a vitriol in the way he's writing, but he's also foregrounding desire and the unknown, and that's what kind of keeps us going. There's something he writes in the text he co-writes with Scherer for a conference on Fourier, where he uses the word untimely, to talk about Fourier. He's situating Fourier in relation to Marx and saying we can't do a dialectic between them. There's not, and he's also in Volition, which I read, we don't have a progression here. And I think that's the way he wants to kind of think about May 68 as something that can't be contained within a sort of dialectical historical progress. And that's the part that I think he wants to sort of save. And what he's kind of getting so angry about people misunderstanding. And then it's interesting. I mean, if we want to, we can also turn to sort of his work, within gay militancy, because I think there's another version of that happens. There's a repetition, but for him, there's something, that there's a difference in the way that the FHAR splinters than how the people in May 68 splintered. But actually, I just also thought of one other thing that we had talked about reading this text, but he talks about one of the problems, I think, and the ways that people talk about May is that it failed because people didn't seize power. But that's precisely where he puts the kind of big lesson of it in this one essay, the everyday life deprivatized by everything. He says, some leftists discover that they don't want to take power, not them, not this power that the bourgeoisie wields. And they don't want to make people work toward the building of a socialism, which they would be the masters. sabotage and laziness are on the agenda of the revolution. So like he kind of counters that whole idea of like the goal of what you're doing, which I think is one of the main issues where people get to, when you get to a point of like with like momentum in the streets, and then people are like, now we need to like get into the halls of power, and without thinking that, then you end up getting caught within the power structure.
And for me also, the idea of the movement was with something very, very interesting in L'Après-Mai, how there is always, how he had a very strategical conception of politics. That means always looking for opening breaches, and as he never wanted to stay in a position, but always wanted to look for a new position where he has something to break or something to bring. The idea of being a kind of disturbation, and always looking for disturbation, or being the one who disturbs, which is very close from the idea of treaties he develops during the FHAR, or in the FHAR ratings, the idea of never be where you are expected to be, and do not respect any institution in the way you are looking always for a way to struggle against any kind of institution, and also including a radical institution, and never be satisfied with the current definition of politics, of radical politics, and always looking for what the radical politics is excluding or missing. It's very close from the idea of critique, as for instance, I don't know, Foucault or Deleuze defined during the 70s.
Yeah, you know, in your book, Antoine, you write, I don't know if this is exactly what, maybe I'm wrong in my reading of it, but you talk about his like shifting of positions as a sort of avant-garde elitism. But I was reading it sort of as his attempt to refuse to be captured or recuperated, that he will always, I mean, he says like, we're quitters, right? We'll like abandon any position. Because also as long as you inhabit this one position, and this is the lesson, particularly for him, as like, you know, he came out publicly as a homosexual in the newspaper, right, and told his story, and he became known as like the professional fag, the professional revolutionary, and it's like, as soon as you identify yourself, then you can be captured. So I saw that sort of, that process of his like always leaving things behind, not simply as like thinking that he's better than everything, but actually that it's a strategy for him to kind of maintain some militancy. Yeah, you're right. You are totally right. And I think he had a very, very strong strategical definition of politics, and the idea of recuperation was like a basis for him, as there is always recuperation, and you always have the risk to be recuperated. So you have always to think to the next step, to the next situation, or to the next consensus you have to disturb. And when he was, it's very striking because, as you mentioned, in January 1972, it came out in the French newspaper, Le Nouvel Observateur, and became openly the figure of the gay movement. And a few months after, in Homosexual Desire, which was released, I think, in September 72, so perhaps 8 months later, he criticized the idea of coming out and the idea of being identified as gay or as homosexual. And there is, and few years after, he still supports some
part of some strategy of the gay movement, and few months later he still criticized the radical gay movement or the gay movement, and he was always balancing between the both position, with this feeling that on the one hand he had to struggle or to participate to a struggle, but on the other hand, he was always fearing this kind of recuperation, or this kind of freezing of the movement, of the claims, of all the energy, which when this political energy became known or recognized, or people get used to it, soon, according to him, it becomes inefficient, and you have always to, according to him, to feel like this inefficiency because of the freezing of the position. So that's why I describe his attitude as avant-gardism or avant-garde elitism. The other part is that there is in some writings, not in L'Après-mai, but more in La Dérive or in other texts on gay movement, especially, like a kind of disdain or scorn towards especially gay people or gay activists, as if they have not understood that the gay politics or the gay issue is no more relevant, and is like blaming them for just being gay, as if they have not understood that it was already too late, and they have to, as if the gay issue was already solved, and as if the gay politics have no more reason to be. There is like a kind of, according to me, like a social distinction sometimes in his writings.
Yeah, Max, did you want to jump in, or? There's one thing that I think is interesting. It's like he sort of characterizes the early gay movement as culminating in like confession and coming out, right? And like that's the biggest thing that it did, was just like allow people to come out, and then immediately coming out becomes like, you know, getting a seat at the table in some way. So like he starts criticizing how both in like the gay movement and in the women's movement, that they start wanting to use the courts and the police like on their behalf, right? And so I think that's really interesting. The other point that he critiques about the limitations of the gay movement and how it gets like limited into identifying as gay, as homosexual, is that as soon as you do that, you leave behind other people, because you're like being, and for him that includes trans people in particular, which I think is really important. He mentions that a lot, and in this book, that like for a certain sector of like gay people to be acceptable, you have to leave behind a whole bunch of other people who will still have to remain like deviant. And so for him, like he's always kind of like holding on to the deviant position. And this also I think is interesting, because it is, his first book is Homosexual Desire, and I see there's a question in the Q&A, and the second part of the question is, Désir is very marked by French, this comes from Emily Apter, by French psychoanalysis at this time. What about this gets lost in translation? And he articulates this from the very beginning, that like that homosexuality as an identity is a bad political, maybe it's like necessary for one step. And that's a question I have for both of you, right? Like how much of gay liberation needs to go through this position of like identifying as a gay person. But for him, the desire, he's very influenced by Deleuze and Guattari, also Fourier, and tries to think of desire as a possibly desublimating desire. Particularly looks at the role of the anus in sort of Freud's like pathway towards like heterosexual genital sexuality, and thinks about like how could you desublimate, and kind of also for him the stakes of that are reworking and destroying and then reworking society and social relations. So for him, desire is this like, it's the fundamental term for him, and it's like this constant movement, and as soon as it gets stopped, and for him, homosexual desire in particular names the like essence of desire as this thing that can't be fully named, and as soon as it gets stopped or named or identified or frozen, or these are all kind of words that he uses, then it serves the kind of role of upholding the society that we live in and the one that he wants to destroy.
What is very striking for me is how he switch from one position to another. For instance, how at the end of the 70s, he wrote a book and co-directed a movie with Lionel Soucaz, which name is Rasdep, a movie on the history of homosexuality. And in the book, in the movie, and in several interviews, he defended the belongship to a social group, that is to say, gay people. And he explains how the knowledge of history and how the culture is a way of preserving or defending oneself and defending a community. And that's something very, for me, very crucial in his writings, is how, as you said in Homosexual Desire, is more trying to think on desire, on fluxes, on desire against identity. And then a few years later, how is more thinking to identity in terms of social identity and how you are defined by the insults, by the homophobia, and how you invent like a culture in order to preserve yourself and to preserve the people of the group. And I don't think there is one conception one on the other, but depending in which situation he was writing or thinking, he chose one or another position and choose the most accurate according to him to the situation. And that's how also the strategy is very present and is always present in his writing and is in intervention, political or theoretical or activist interventions.
Antoine, can I also ask the first part of this question from Emily after, and I think this might be one that you're best positioned to answer. And she says, thanks for the discussion. Wonder if one of you could address where Hocquenghem was vis-a-vis philosophers and writers like Gilles Châtelet, Guattari, Hervé Guibert, Mathieu Landon. My sense is that there weren't real relations among them, but in hindsight, one sees overlaps. If I remember, Châtelet was on his dissertation committee, right? Or he worked with them?
You said Gilles Châtelet or François Châtelet, because there are two Châtelet. François Châtelet was a philosopher, and he was very close to Châtelet, and indeed Châtelet was a member of his defense committee. But there was also the writer Gilles Châtelet, who was also a member of the FHAR and a gay activist, and they were very close. And Châtelet was the author, I think, in the 90s, of a pamphlet. The French title is Vivre et penser comme des porcs, like to live and to think like pigs, which was very critical of the left, of the consumption society, of the neoliberalism. And both they were very close when during Hocquenghem's life, and they even traveled together to Brazil, and there are very nice pictures of both of them in Brazil. He was not very close of Mathieu Landon. Mathieu Landon was much younger, and Landon was more close to Foucault, to Michel Foucault, and Hocquenghem knew Foucault, and they knew well each other, but they were not close friends. And Landon, I interviewed Landon when I was writing the biography, and Landon didn't know very well Hocquenghem. and the same for Guibert. They knew a bit each other, I think, but I'm not sure they like each other very much, but I don't know. But they were not so close, and they didn't write about each other. So yeah, it was two separate worlds, I think. And I forgot the name. It was Châtelet, Guibert Lindon, and Guattari.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he was very close to Guattari, especially at the beginning of the 70s. Guattari was, of course, because of Anti-Oedipus, and Anti-Oedipus was a very strong and very crucial book for Hocquenghem, and also because Guattari was the director of a magazine, Recherche, and Recherche hosted an issue about gay and sexual liberation. The name of the issue was 3 billions of perverts, and it was seized by the police. It was a long story, but it's a very fascinating issue on sexual liberation, not only gay liberation and sexual liberation. And they were Hocquenghem and Guattari were very close at that time. And still, they were perhaps not personally close during the 80s, but Guattari wrote a book about the French politics in the 80s, whose title is Les années d'hiver, Years of Winter. And the way Guattari describes the French political situation at that time is very close to the book written by Hocquenghem in 86, the open letter to who shifted from the Colmao to the Rotary Club, which is a book against the former leftist who shifted to the right after the election of François Mitterrand. So they were still very close intellectually, but perhaps not so close in everyday life.
Let's see. There's another question from Zakir in the chat. Mac, do you want to? But I want to give you a space to jump in. Mac.
Oh, I was gonna say we should read that question because that's an interesting one.
Okay. So Zakir asks, Deleuze in his preface talks about killing the Hegel and the Marx inside each of us. It seems this is linked to evolution as an alternative to dialectics, a way of thinking and acting that would allow one to say something like FHAR is linked to ecological movements, even though he is unspeakable in political logic. Could you say more about this way of making connections without symbolic relationships? I'm thinking too of the ecological in connection to flowers and bicycles a la Proust in Deleuze's preface as examples of multifaceted and localized homosexuality.
That's very striking. If you look for the what is written about Hegel in the beginning of the 70s, if you look at Deleuze, if you look at Foucault, if you look at François Châtelet, there is a real desire to break up with Hegelian philosophy, and it's very striking how Hegel is constituted as an opponent in the field of political philosophy. And I think it's strongly connected to Marxism and to the idea of a transcendentism. I'm not sure if it's the right word in English, but the way there is in Hocquenghem the opposition between transcendence and immanence, which is very close, and for him, or for Deleuze and for the other, there is on one hand Hegel and the transcendence, that is to say a hierarchy and a definition of politics which is above us. And against to transcendence, there is the idea of immanence, that is to say, a politic from the people, from the struggles, with no predefined definition, with no predefined hierarchy, but always the invention of new models of politics. For Hocquenghem, I think it's the way we can understand this reference by Deleuze to Hegel.
I was going to say also that line made me kind of laugh because one of his comrades in the FHAR is Françoise Daubonne, who is the founder of the tradition of ecofeminism or whatever. So it's like there is this sort of very non-dialectical, quite practical link, which is that's his comrade who he's in meetings with. But that's not a particularly like non-symbolic answer.
I mean, I think like that. So we had talked about reading another part, but I don't know if I want to take the time to do that. But this question makes me think of a couple of things that he writes in the essay Towards a Homosexual View of the World, which was one of the texts that it was like a pamphlet that the FHAR distributed in 1971. And maybe this helps get to some of it. You know, like, first of all, sort of in the distinction between transcendence and immanence that Antoine's talking about, like what Hocquenghem in this text is reflecting on a refusal to kind of make clear demands, which is another reason why I connect this to a certain kind of anarchism, because he's like, well, we've been talking about, should we write a manifesto? I don't know if we shouldn't write I don't think we should write a manifesto, right? And he also thinks a lot about how the FHAR meetings were not simply like political meetings, but also like the biggest cruising spot in Paris at the time, which he says maybe the greatest accomplishment of the FHAR is that they had like a cruising spot outside of the police control for a while until the police kind of did come in and break it up. And so I think for him, there's not this distinction, and there's a refusal for the demand. And then there's this idea that, like, he says, I think that conscious homosexuals have a way of envisioning the whole world, politics included, that is unique to them. It is precisely because they live by embracing the most particular situation that what they think has universal value. That is why we don't need revolutionary generalizations, abstractions repeated half-heartedly. I even believe that the homosexual vision of the world is right now the most radical way there is to speak about everything and act on everything. So, I mean, he's using some of these kind of like Hegelian terms here too, I think, but trying to upend them. To me, again, like I'm always sort of have a Combahee River Collective statement in my mind that they say the same thing, like for a Black woman to be free means that everyone else would be free because she stands at like a particular place in the interlocking oppressions of like racial, cis-hetero, patriarchal capitalism. I think he's saying a similar thing, that like starting from this place, which is where he also happens to be, is where you can find the kind of non-symbolic connections of the of these different movements. And then in particular, just wanted to tie it to another thing that he talks about is that what is so important about the gay movement for him is this refusal of the relationship of penetration, right? He says, like, which for him is like sort of the biggest symbol. It's like the phallus, it's the symbol of heterosexuality, of like a penis and a vagina. And he says, like, also like the men and women working next to each other in gay liberation, women liberation movement, or the gay and lesbian people in FHAR, like they are representing a way of relating that doesn't prioritize penetration. Even if it's doing it, it's like parody or reversible. It makes me think a little bit of Bataille there too. So like he actually makes it very concrete into this like this physical act too. And one of the ways he talks about that in Homosexual Desire also is like just plugging parts into other parts, right? Without thinking of the kind of the whole that it would be aimed at assembling. Zucker is asking also if Max could talk a little bit about Amphitheater of the Dead, which is the novel that Max translated, or a science fiction memoir. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, Max?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, so that is a semi-fictionalized account of his life, basically comprising the years in which this text is like collecting. So or not only, I mean, it also has this, his sort of childhood that Antoine was explaining a little bit about. And then it has this kind of fantastic sort of future, alt future 2018 written from the perspective of 1998, which is a whole different story. But I think like the meat of the book is his experience with May and with the gay liberation movement. And he kind of narrates it as, one of the things that I find most interesting about it is he narrates it as like, the sort of real passage from one world into another. So he's like, he is a homosexual subject of some sort before liberation. So he's like this kind of like younger man in relation to older closeted, but like not closeted men who like basically have these sort of like, these closeted societies of faunes, of like queens, basically, that like he has entry to because he's this beautiful young man, and then like through the sort of like event of revolution or the almost revolution of May '68 and the sort of his coming out or whatever. That world is totally swept away, basically, and you kind of like have this new sort of like egalitarian, non-age hierarchized a possibility of relationships with like your peers that you're cruising in the university whatever room that you've commandeered. And yeah, I mean, and he sort of narrates the scenes that are surrounding the composition of these texts that are collected in this book. So it was really interesting for me to read like the actual sort of like theoretical positions that I was like more familiar with, the like characters and like the arguments that he narrated, as people were having around who was going to write this manifesto or whatever. That he ultimately is kind of disdainful of. But yeah, I mean, I wonder, I don't know how much the two of you like read it the same way, but I wonder if that experience of like seeing a kind of like a semi-coherent, semi-total way of life just like fall away might have something to do with his attachment to volution as opposed to revolution, or as like a kind of like commitment to this like this like inventiveness that is just about preventing the reemergence of a kind of prior form.
I think thanks for describing the book, and then that I think that's a really important question. I'm going to also weave in a question from the Q&A because I think I think in my mind it connects. Madeline asked, would love to hear more about the relationship between abandonment and fidelity, or the political strategy of abandonment as a form of fidelity. Just a fascinating connection that keeps coming up here, such a generative discussion. So I think like you brought it up, Max, and Antoine brought it up too. So like in Hocquenghem's sort of like disgust with the direction of the homosexual movement, at a certain point, he like sort of rebukes the role, like he doesn't even want to use that term for himself anymore. And you brought up the term faux, which is like how he starts to talk about himself, or like what could be after the homosexual would be the faux or a queen. And for him, it's like this like Baroque kind of refusal of identity, a person that like inhabits like the geography of the city in a particular way too. And there's, you write about this, Antoine, like there's a kind of nostalgia in this that sort of seems to contradict his idea of like the revolutionary aspects of homosexuality as a kind of like breaking up of identity or desire that can't be fixed, by going into what, like, I think sort of what you were talking about, Antoine, is like a minoritarian culture of like the homosexual in the city that like goes back to the 19th century. And like he wants to preserve something of that because for him that still has the trapping of of resisting the normal culture, and he doesn't think that it can still be normalized. Although I guess if he was around right now, he might have a different perspective, because like I think a lot of that stuff is like basically all of like mainstream culture now. But to me, that always, so it brings to mind what Yves Sedgwick writes in the Epistemology of the Closet, which is something that I'm always like thinking about and writing about, is that there's a fundamental definitional incoherence in the idea of the homosexual that's torn between this universalizing tendency and a minoritarian like community. And that will, like, there's no way to resolve that within the term itself. And I think that we sort of see Hocquenghem playing with that. So for me, evolution, or like abandoning stuff and like not being pure, like, you know, going into the places that you're not supposed to be and fucking with them in some way. Like, I think those are his ways of like sort of trying to, I don't know, exist in an impossible situation, right? Like a situation that's deemed as revolutionary, but is also being domesticated at the same moment. And that he's still living in a way that he lived before, like you said, Max, like, you know, he was he's like, I didn't even, like, he was sleeping with guys before he called himself a homosexual, right? Yeah, so I think those are ways for him to like think that, and then that position that he takes, is a way to get around the kind of traps of the revolutionary moralism that says there's one way to do things, and we all have to follow that, or the massive politics of like getting everyone to agree on something. So those are just some of my thoughts.
And there is in L'Après-Mai, in Gay Liberation after May 68, there is a very striking text from the FHAR, which is, I think the title in English should be Toward an Homosexual View of the World, I think. And it underlines how sexuality is not like an identity for him in the way it's typified, in the way he was typified, but it's more like a minoritarian view of the world, and always view of the relationships in which you are involved. And it's not a question of being something, but more of a way of being, like, I don't know if you would agree, but like homosexuality as a way of life, in looking for the breakup, the criticism, and this minoritarian view of all the relationship and all the relationship of power around you, around him.
Max, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'm not. I was trying to find. I was going to suggest we might even read a little bit of that, because I thought that the way he phrases it there is kind of interesting. But I don't know. I don't know if we want to, like, at this late hour, if we want to get into reading, or should we?
I perhaps before I can add something on the idea of fidelity. It's very striking to. I said previously that the question of the strategy was and the displacement was very important for him. And in 1974, at the beginning of the book, he says that May 68 is over and we have to forget May 68. But 10 years later, during the 80s, when all the left claimed that May 68 is over and that we have to break up with all the motto, all the slogan of the May 68 and the 70s, he writes, he wants to make May 68 still alive. So there is, just to underline how this question of fidelity, of abandonment, is always located, or always located and situated in relationship to a context and to a social, cultural, and political context?
I think, Max, there might be like I thought of this passage from Towards a Homosexual View of the World, which is also where I took the last couple of things I read. So I maybe just read a little bit of it, because I think this might pertain, if everyone's okay with that. So he says, this is what we defend. That is why no love, real love without equality. The world is thirsty for love, but we know that the love heterosexuals offer is used to hide the domination of women by men. That is why homosexual love is currently the only love that aims at equality, because being marginalized, it has no social use. Because power struggles are not initially imposed by society. Because here the roles man, woman, fucked, fucker, master, slave are unstable and reversible at every turn. This is what we defend under the name homosexuality. That is why we say we will be normal when you all become homosexuals. We don't want a homosexuality that would be accepted alongside heterosexuality. Because in our societies, heterosexuality is the rule, the norm, and you can't make the norm coexist with the abnormal. There's always a struggle between them. We want the end of heterosexuality, in the sense that heterosexuality is at this moment inevitably a relationship of oppression. This is not a sexual issue, it is above all an emotional issue. The relationship of penetration of the woman by the man has been given such value by the Judeo-Christian capitalist system that no heterosexual, however liberated they are, can pass it up. If he doesn't fuck his woman, he feels frustrated. There are many who say, our aim is not to establish a single sexuality, homosexuality. We're for bisexuality, for sexual and emotional freedom. They also say, what counts as a true love relationship between everyone, men and women, or men and men, or women and women? But there's no egalitarian love without struggle, because all of society turns love into a way to uphold inequality. And the practical form of the struggle, we can't avoid it, is the passage through homosexuality. The passage through fully accepted homosexuality. I believe that those who say, but my tastes are bisexual, I want to be able to love everyone, want to do without this passage through the moment where sexuality and feelings totally escape the dominant model. In short, as Margaret would say, I don't readily believe in bisexuality because it inherently derives from the prevailing form of emotional relations, heterosexuality. It replicates the relations of oppression. I could only believe in bisexuality derived from homosexuality. That is to say, once the homosexual struggle has effectively destroyed all sexual norms. I thought that was pertinent just because, like, I think it really elucidates another place where people get confused, and also kind of where he is like super insistent, right? Like, the thing is to destroy oppression. Like, the thing is to destroy the process of normalization, right? And so in that way, homosexuality is important as a particular position to start from, but ultimately not what you're aiming for, right? He's like, not like, and at the end of this, even though he says we'll like give it up when you're all gay, at the end of this, that's not what he wants, is everyone to be gay, right? He wants like some other form of social relations that haven't been enacted yet, that we can't predict, that we don't see. And so when like, you know, his former comrades take the seats of power, or like, you know, plug into the system in the ways they do, or become professional leftists or whatever, they're giving up the struggle part, which is the thing that he won't give up. And that's maybe also like why he'll always be taking a counter position, right? And maybe that's another way of thinking about what volution means, is like, is the struggle, it's not the end, right? The revolution thinks it's over, and the volution is the process.
Yeah, Madeline, that's a really good question. And I think, Scott, you found a good passage for that. Yeah, it seems like I'm going to read a really brief thing also from another one that we didn't read the totality of, which is a text that they write in their magazine 2 from September 1970. So like early in the, like, you know, the process of like abandoning, recuperating, maintaining fidelity or whatever. He says, I want to know that I also fight to lose my miserable and repressed identity, the one associated with my ID card, my social security number, my place in the line, the mystification of my social future, and accordingly the radical destruction of the oppressive prophesizing of identity papers is on the agenda. I want to know that it won't stop, that the revolution will not say, it's over, now everybody go home, that it will not end, that we will escape the monstrous prehistory where man is wolf to man under the mask of law and order. I mean, that's so lovely. That's just such a beautiful piece of, I mean, he's like, he still has the kind of like revolutionary like rhetoric flowing. So obviously it's like a joy to encounter. But I think it does some explanatory work in this question of like, okay, why, like, what does he mean by being against the revolution in favor of something else? Like, what does it mean for him to be against these identities or to be like for abandonment or whatever? Because like he's definitely he's you know, it's an incoherent collection of texts. He's taking a bunch of different positions and you know, contradicting himself and stuff like that. And so like maybe this is just a motivated reading, but I'm taking this as a kind of like statement of like what he's actually trying to do with all of these different positions is like, okay, the various sort of revolutionary propositions that are like out there in the Parisian gauchist scene or whatever seem insufficient. And so like fidelity to them or fidelity to this sort of project would mean abandoning the total revolution or the total sort of like liberation or overthrow of this monstrous prehistory. And inversely, abandoning it would mean maintaining a kind of like actually effective fidelity. So if you're like, okay, I have this, I'm trying out this new thing, we're going to do sort of public crystallized identity stuff. But then like the year afterwards, I've decided that it's like actually, it's quite restrictive, it's boring, it's like, it is itself a kind of recuperation. Yeah, the question is basically just like, do you, because you have some kind of like prior commitment to being self-consistent or having some kind of fidelity with your past attempts, which were just attempts, do you like double down and say like, actually it was the right thing the whole time and nobody gets it and like everybody is just like not revolutionary enough to see why this type of politics is the right way? Or do you say, yeah, actually I'm not that interested in it anymore. It was never going to be the sort of end point for us anyway. And like, it's a little unsatisfying, I admit. You know, I definitely like come to these kinds of thinkers because of their participation in these like, you know, thrilling moments. And I imagine that they have something kind of like decisive to impart to the future, whatever. But it is a bit more realistic also that like, you know, everybody is kind of like sorting these things out in a moment of revolution. Like it's not going to be clear, you know, which sort of like political commitments you had beforehand will survive or will actually guide you through in the right way. So I appreciate this kind of like chaotic like refusal sometimes that he's doing.
I think also like, you know, exactly what you're saying is for me what is so interesting and what I was trying to kind of align with or like bring into conversation with like a sort of queer anarchism, because like, first of all, I think he really highlights throughout this book failure, like being wrong and like splintering groups, right? Like groups dissolving is like an important moment, like not keeping something, like you said, like just insisting that you were right because you had this idea once. But like breaking up stuff, for me, that's like a huge part of like what I understand is like a kind of anarchism. And then also like the thing that all these people that what he keeps pointing out, I think everyone sort of holds something holy. And then as long as you hold something holy in this process of revolution, you're gonna be holding on to like some aspect of the society that you're fighting against, right? So it could be like, or another way of saying it would be like naturalizing certain ways of being, right? Saying that that's just how like people are. Like heterosexuality is like totally natural and normal or whatever, right? And like we can't go against that. So anything like, I think like a lot of limitation for revolutionary thinking is when people stop somewhere being like, we want society, we want civilization, like we can't get rid of this. And he wants to go all the way. It's not to say like he's not like a kind of totally anti-civilizationalist, but a more like a utopian person who's thinking like there's something on the other side. We just don't know it, and we can't have parts of this world in that world. I had there's a couple questions that came up for Antoine. One in the Q&A says, from Emmanuel, is a question for everyone, but mostly Antoine. I was wondering how you understand the way he addressed the colonial question in his life and theoretical work, especially in relation to Arabs and us, Morel's critique of that in the Screwball Asses, and also in Hocquenghem's non-theoretical works like L'amour en relief and Rastiep, etc. Thank you all so much. This is important, I think.
That's a huge question, and very, very interesting and very stimulating. There is I was talking previously about the issue of the magazine Recherche, like the encyclopedia of sexuality, and the race is a huge question in that issue, in this issue, and also in the issue of the leftist newspaper too, and devoted to homosexual or sexual revolution, and both of them were edited by Hocquenghem, or coordinated by Hocquenghem. There is a very strong paradox. On one hand, there is like the project to address to the colonial France and to address to the racist society, and the idea of to criticize the French society for its racism. But on the other hand, there is a lot of racism in this text, and especially the way they are describing gay sexuality between Arab men and gay people or gay activists. And there is several texts that are dealing with these relations, and most of them are very racist in the way it's just white men who are talking about Arab men, or for some of them black men, and they are not dealing with the fact they are all white, speaking about non-white people. And that very strange, there is a very, we can understand this text if we are thinking to, for instance, a novel which was written in 1967, I think, by Claire Etcherelli, and the title of the novel is Élise ou la vraie vie. And it describes a relationship between two workers, a French white woman and Algerian man. And Claire Etcherelli described how such a relationship is quite impossible in the France of the 60s, and how both of them are always insulted by the people around them. And I think the French activists, French gay activists like Hocquenghem, were aware of such a situation, and they wanted to deal with it in their writings, but they did not succeed to deal it fully, as they, for instance, they are describing all the Arab men like sexual objects. They have no name, no feelings, but there is all the racist stereotypes that we can find elsewhere. So there is this very strange paradox, and there is also the fact that the fact that the texts are racist is recognized by the activists, who claim, even if the texts are racist, it is important to publish them in order to show or to reveal the conscious or unconscious racism that also activists can have. there is, he wrote also a book titled the Beauty, La beauté du métis, the beauty of mixed race people, and also the novel L'amour en relief, Love in Relief, which was translated into English, I think, in the 80s, and which is very interesting because it's the story of a Tunisian guy who is blind and bisexual. And the book is dealing with 3 kinds of oppression: the blindness, the race, and the bisexuality. And I think it's more interesting than, not more interesting, but the perspective of the race is not the same that in the previous texts, and it's very interesting to see how Hocquenghem tried to intersect them.
It froze for a second, so I wasn't sure whether you were done. But I think thank you for elaborating on that. Like, my sense of, like, in this book too, is that, like, he's trying to find a position that's anti-racist and is not succeeding at it because he has, like, he's stuck in his position in some ways. But one other question, and maybe this could be a good last one, and again, sort of probably geared most towards you, Antoine, is how this, like, work looks from a contemporary queer culture in France. I mean, I think that would be interesting to hear, and also maybe, like, the work that, if there's work that you think is comparable to what Hocquenghem was doing then, now.
I think there is, like in the US, there is a deep rediscovery of Hocquenghem today in France. When I began my research, there were not so much books available, and for 10 years there were some new publication and new edition of books, and I see that Hocquenghem is more and more quoted and used in radical politics, in radical queer politics, and also in radical politics. Perhaps it's first as a part of the global movement of rediscovery of the 70s, like we are 50 years later, there is one generation, and there is like a rediscovery of what happened, but there is also radical movements that are more stronger and more powerful than a few years ago, and that are looking for, I'm not sure if it's models, but from inspiration, and Hocquenghem is part of this inspiration.
That's interesting because it's sort of a similar thing here. I just want to also, I'm going to put in the chat a link to get the book if you want it with a 30% discount. If you're interested in purchasing it, this link will take you there, and there's like a coupon code. And I also, Max, if you had any like final thoughts, I would love to hear what you have to say. No pressure. No.
You know, I did have a really brilliant insight, but it totally slipped my mind now. So I'm just gonna keep it to myself.
That's the way, I think, that's the most brilliant kind of stance to take.
Well, I'd like to thank you all again for this wonderful conversation, and encourage you to pick up a copy of Scott's great translation, and maybe you'll find a long summer afternoon to read it.